Uh, I guess we can do that now. Better switch to chatting hub. All right, I got a topic for today. Well, it's a relatively small topic. I was gonna ask Eric about what he thought about self-help. Actually, joshing. Yeah, no more clinking sounds. They still exist here and there, but most of the modern casinos, they use digital now. So you scan a card. It's kind of like the arcades. All the arcades are the modern arcades. They use digital stuff now. So like tickets, you know, uh, there are still old arcades where those paper tickets flow out in the hundreds and stuff. But generally speaking, nowadays digital tickets. You use a uh card, a scanning device, and then it accumulates a digital information on it, and then you redeem using that type of it, just to reduce waste and modernize the things. So no more like carrying a bag of like 6,000 tickets that if you were like me, you would meticulously fold into a single stack, or you're like that other person who like individually rip every single ticket so that they can perfectly stack on each other, and then bring in like rubber bands and stuff and just have them neatly stacked. Or you're that guy who brings in like a gigantic garbage bag and just chuck all the paper tickets into the, and it'd be like a see-through bag, typically like a transparent bag, so you can see all the tickets in there. Those were the old days. But yes, Yakuza. I think yeah, Witcher would be the closest long game, but no, they're different. Yeah, they're in a different location. I think that's probably the biggest deal. In reflection, I hope to finish grinding the rest of the farm, the rest of the currency, so I can trade it in and finish the completion task. I finished every completion task except getting the weapons at this point, with a few minor things. But I think that novelty, it was a novelty back in the day, but it's no longer a novelty now. And I think it would appeal to many new gamers of now, where the idea is to keep the location the same familiar location, but do an iteration of it. And it works so well now, but I can definitely tell back in like PlayStation days, like the early PlayStation 2 days, that type of design would not fly. Generally speaking, most games, even console games, are still in that state where every new game is a distinct possibility for a game to be very, very different. The new, uh, always new IPs every day. That was the name of the game when Yakuza 1 came out. And actually, funny trivia, I get, or I'm going down the rabbit hole. Yakuza was actually, the first pitch for Yakuza was denied. Like, it was hard to get Yakuza 1 off the ground, and a lot of it worked against it. For example, like Yakuza is one of the few games of that time that was marketed directly to Japanese adults. Like, organized crime, generally speaking, is for withhold your stereotypes and whatnot, but it is male oriented. Organized crime is male dominant as well, and many of the stuff that's involved in organized crime, a backdrop of organized crime, is just incredibly male forward. So when they were pitching this game, it was difficult because it caps how successful the game can be lucratively. In fact, there was some estimates back then. They estimate no more or around less than 100,000 copies would be sold if a game was marketed directly to Japanese adults. And Yakuza 1 sorta only kinda appealed outside of Japan. But thanks to Yakuza 0, it received international appeal. And then further more elaborations and iterations completed to extend its appeal. It is still largely a male oriented game. I mean, regardless of how you feel, the dynamics of gender roles and perception and whatnot, statistically and emphatically, the way the subject matters are so, these are historical pieces. Yakuza is taking place not anachronistically in alternative universe. It's occupying a period in Japan that is that governs and restricts how the characters and the stuff in the city happens. And to pretend like it is different and it can be female forward or be inclusive when it's trying to capture the essence of that would be ironically insensitive. So in my opinion, it was also one of the things that keep the series from ever like landing a top spot on people's lists. But for me, it is not by coincidence, I don't think. My path crossing Yakuza was very not coincidence. There are many factors that led me to this point because it's a novel experience. I when I see another, another Souls game, it's not a novel experience. I even not playing it, even playing it, it's not a novel experience anymore. So, at the same time, I don't feel it's a novel experience either for Yakuza. I mean, coincidentally, it's actually two different systems. So the difference between Kiwami 2 and Kiwami 1 was dramatic because Kiwami 2 was completely overhauled. And that was gigantic. Like, my reaction to that was flabbergastedness. But moving forward from now, all of them are going to be normalized to those two systems that are there. But it doesn't do what all the other game does, where they move inherently away. They try to reinvent the thing. They almost unapologetically don't reinvent. They refine. It's like so refined to the point that Yakuza is a remaster and a refinement of its sub every single time. So it's hard to not play one game and evaluate one game without considering the interests of the following game. It's different from saying playing Souls 1 to Souls 2. Like, in a sense that, yes, many people are very comfortable with comparing games and their legacies. But Yakuza, it's not comparing legacies, it's just necessary to have them. So playing 1 invokes 2 and 3 and 4. It complements into an entire game, like an entire legacy, as opposed to we're trying to reinvent the legacy and one up it. The RGG studios don't need to one up it. They just have to keep on. They're just more and more compelled to be creative within a confined space. It's so weird, but fun at the same. It's so novel to me, and I'm curious if there are other. I'm thinking about seeing if there are other game series that fit the same characteristic. I would love to have another game series to compare that type of structure with. Yeah, not even Game Freaks' carryover in mechanics can make up for the living organism that is the Yakuza world. Sometimes I do think of it like Star Wars, but Star Wars continue to expand more and more out of its locale, like continue proliferating. I don't necessarily think RGG will ever earn the limelight and the spotlight off Kamurocho and Sotenberry. Like it is the defining core to this series. And I don't think there's a game that I'm aware of, a game series that I'm aware of, where their core is the world, not the characters. Kiryu lives in the core. He's featured and the events feature him, but all the city features these characters, not the other way around. These characters did not define, like characterize, they characterize part of the city. The city engulfs the characters. So this game is to develop more, to make more Yakuza games, you continuously just make more characters to breathe more detail into the city. So it allows games like Judgment, Lost Judgment, all the spin-offs are possible because Kamurocho exists. And this reminds me of Star Trek a lot. The characters of Star Trek exist, but the Federation exists. So as Star Trek moves from period to period, the characters change. The world doesn't change. Like the Federation doesn't change. The organization is characterized by characters, not the other way around. The characters don't define the world that they're in. They don't perpetually like move the world to craziness and whatnot. The Federation will always exist. They have the conflicts and stuff. The different characters have to tackle the system that they're placed in all the time. And as much as I like to be attached to, like, as much as I want to empathize with people who get attached to characters, it's far less intriguing, in my opinion, than the world people live in. It's far more confusing too, and could be very tough, but in a way, that's kind of how I look at life. Life is not just the main character. Life is all the character and the systems a character interacts with. So whenever you're looking and answering questions and complaining about things, you have perspective. Not that it will give you any respite from respite from anxiety, unknowns, and complexities. However, it does give you groundedness, realism, and scope. So hope they continue to make more games and different characters and different storylines in Kamurocho, because Sega, this group, was way ahead of the game. Like when we think about how far ahead the MCU cinematic universe, the DCEU, didn't even exist yet. It's like 10 years, like, but here there are comic books, right? We're going back to comic books, like verses, universes, closed systems that gets proliferated over and over again with more characters. That is an old system, and they captured it in a video game well before. So for example, we live in a metaverse now, right? But RGG has already made a metaverse of Kamurocho well before the industry standard to make metaverses. And it's fantastic because now when you think about it, Kamurocho, who's in Kamurocho universe? Kiryu, Ichiban, the I somewhat kind of spoiled myself, but there's like 4 characters in Yakuza 4 and 4 characters in Yakuza 5. Like, five, you know, all of them are in Kamurocho's universe. They created the Yakuza universe. It's far different from this is Skywalker's legacy. Like, for example, Disney, this is Skywalker's legacy. Skywalker legacy is just one legacy. It's one set of characters. It can only appeal to the empathy of those who relate to that character. That's why, to me, Star Wars, and to Eric as well, we both agree that Star Wars is not big enough. The scope is not big enough. It's a character driven thing. Kiryu, yes, if you're like the new age people, you might think it's a character driven game, but it's so far from a character driven game. It's nice that it can be interpreted as a character driven game. But Kiryu doesn't always have to be there for a Yakuza game. Ichiban, that detective from Judgment, they don't have to be there for that game to still exist. And that's what I love about world-focused game. Like, Geralt of Rivia does not have to be there for it to be a Witcher game. Like, Geralt is... I mean, they might bring him back because of, like, emotional baggage. But, the idea is, if you're ever wondering, are you watching a world-building asset or a character-driven thing? Ask yourself, if that character disappears, would it be the same game? Or would it be like the same movie, the same TV show? How inconsequential is the character? Well, the character can have impact and shape, but if the character didn't happen, it would be another character. So that's kind of what I missed. And I am so deep into Yakuza because I'm so invested in the city, like in Japan, like in those two area. Like, I want to know what happened. Like, for example, the Witcher universe, I want to know what other characters are doing while Geralt is doing this stuff. Like, yeah, it's great, we keep seeing Geralt's antics and stuff. It's like, that's nice, but that's also what attracted me to not Game of Thrones, a Song of Fire and Ice, way back. It's not about just, I mean, like G.R.R. Martin showed it already, right? He literally, sorry, spoilers, but he, kills off the most charismatic character right off the bat in the first book, right? It's to demonstrate that it's the world that persists beyond the characters. The characters live in this world. They can die by the sword, they can come and go, but it's the feud, it's the kingdom, it's the imminent winter that's coming, right? That's kind of the idea. While Daenerys will have her reign, and whatnot, or whatever happens because the book is not out yet, like the actual canonical book, but they come and go. King's Fall, King's Landing, and like Winterfell come and go. Like the different houses lose. That's the idea. It's the universe that captures it. And the MCU did the same. Disney did the same. Like, now is the golden time. And I actually think if Sega is, I'm happy to see that Sega is pushing forth. Like, the publishing group is pushing Yakuza forward. Like, they, there's advertisements, like all the outlets are getting, and it's picking up steam. And to me, before this fad goes away, this is the golden opportunity. And Yakuza is already 7+ games in deep. It's called I think there was a euphemism for this, the Yakuza community iceberg. Like, that's how deep it goes. It's kind of like suddenly some of the Yakuza fans discover Fate Stay Night. Fate Stay Night's universe is gigantic. Like, but it's gigantic, but it's also varied, even more so than Yakuza. So depending on the approach, people are creating their own universes, and this studio started it over over 15 years ago. It's a long play, but one thing is worth noting though is I noticed that just like Sakaguchi with Final Fantasy, Yakuza 7 is his last game with RGG Studios. Nagashi left to create Nagashi Studios with like a different publisher called NetEase, which is 99% of gamblers. Yeah. Well, yeah. So, yeah. And also here's uh so hopefully the person who took over Nagashi is the original like general director and all that stuff, and he was the guy who pitched all the Yakuza games, and he wrote Judgment Lost Judgment. I don't know what's going to happen to Judgment Lost Judgment, but all the Yakuza games were written by the new guy who took over. I think his name was like Tokoyama or something. I was looking through the credits and all that of all the games without like trying to accidentally spoil myself too much, but the writer is now taking the helm. So the writer who wrote all the Yakuza games or Like a Dragon games is taking head in his place. I don't know, maybe it's creative freedom or whatnot. Often you see when people want to branch out and do other IPs, I'm guessing Nagashi wants to go and do other IPs, kind of like Kojima leaving or disputing and all that. So maybe we'll see a game from him that's unmistakably like Yakuza, but maybe he'll take a different backdrop, like somewhere else, like another part of Japan, or might jump to a Chinese setting or something, because Chinese settings are pretty in trend right now. They're pretty hot, turning existing systems and game theories with a Chinese setting. So it's pretty hot right now. We might be able to see, I don't know, a Beijing, Shanghai version. There's a possibility, generally speaking. But I don't know about that. But Nagashi, generally the head person, what they do is they tend to do what their first debut studio title tends to be something they do really, really well, but the IP has to differentiate itself contextually from its parental. So let's hope it's not oh, we already made this game, but we want to make it this way, Callisto Protocol kind of deal. More like I left on meaningful terms with RGG Studios to make a game like Yakuza, but I don't want to make Yakuza. And I look forward to seeing what that studio ends up doing. The guy who helmed Yakuza has left and made his own studio, and NetEase probably gave him a great deal on establishing his studio, so he can pick a different context. It's not more of a dispute in creative freedom, but more like the future of his creative freedom. So the writers still stayed. It wasn't like everyone just left or mass exodus because of creative restrictions. So the writer's still there. So I'm very hopeful for Yakuza 8 and Yakuza 6.5. And that's crazy. And I am a little concerned. Like, I don't usually have this a lot of times where when you think of a game and you're going into the next game, you realize like, man, this could be the slump season, right? There's no question that Star Trek universe is the biggest universe that I've ever invested in. I've watched every single Star Trek's cinematic universe. I call it cinematic universe, but it's not necessarily a movie per se. It's on the screen universe. Outside of the most recent, the reboot ones, which I only have not seen one of them, which is Star Trek Discovery. I did not finish watching the most recent seasons, but Yakuza is just that for video games. It's one of the largest, and it's such a shame because I was looking at where does Yakuza lie in people's minds. Like, what is its exposure? It's non-existent. So, like for example, whenever you look up franchises, series, lore, canon, most of them get disqualified when you place Yakuza in the series. Like, it's not the same. It's so unique that it's pretty astonishing how it doesn't stand alone somewhere on a list. Like, I wouldn't classify it as the best selling series because it's not. The best mechanical franchise of all time, it's not. But what is the longest persistent series that features a singular platform or world? There isn't any other franchise that would qualify for that. The closest I can think of is like Final Fantasy Crystallis. So like technically almost all the Final Fantasy games that deal with crystals revolve around the same Crystallis saga, so they're kind of in the same universe. And then you could, I don't know, make a light, very light nod to Kingdom Hearts maybe, where it can cross over two large legacies and sample them, but they're crossover titles. They're not persistent titles. It's not watching, I don't know, playing Iron Man and Spider-Man and Thor and Hulk, and then suddenly you play the fourth game and you realize they all occupied the same United States. And they all have overlap of the same United States. So like playing 4 separate video games that take place in the same exact New York scape. Or you find out that, you know, so in this way, there are very few games that meet the qualities of Yakuza, and that makes it novel. That makes it extremely underrated. Extremely. But it's also so poetically appropriate for the gamers of today. The downside is it's a hard sell because most of its modernized mechanics, which it does now have modernized mechanics, do not fit the modernized mechanics. So it will only generally appeal to novelty seekers. So the combat is frustrating. It's footsies only. It's counting frames. It's counting numbers. Like, legitimately, to become great at Yakuza, you read the inputs. So your goal is to read the inputs, not in the same way as, sorry, that's a bad word. Not a bad word. That's a confusing word, because when people think of reading, they think of broadcasting. Like, oh, this swing is indicating this amount of attack. No, reading as in fighting games, when you read a player. So like you read, it's like, I knew you were going to do a high in 4 seconds. I took a gamble. That's a read. So I downloaded you, kind of thing. Not downloading in the same of FromSoft and stuff where, oh, here's an indicator of this attack. Oh, these attacks are followed by these attacks. It's just guess. In the next 3 or 4 seconds, they can use 1 of 3 moves. Guess. Or you can make an approach and say, well, it can't hit me in this space. So you're constantly playing more like a regular fighter game, like an old school fighter game, like Virtual Fighter. It's basically Virtual Fighter. And nowadays video games are not made like that. They're more like Tekken and the modernized Street Fighter, where there are reads, counterplays, but even then it's still closer to a fighter. It's like Street of Rage. Like when you're going through like the beat 'em up games, It's like they're either gonna hit you or they're not gonna hit you. Like you don't have all the responses you can. If you think it's coming, it doesn't mean you can block it. Like you have to know that your character can't block at sometimes. It's not that, oh, why can't I operate because it's not beyond my human limit. It's like, well, that's modern titles. Modern titles, and you probably could poll, and I would say, this is a little bit of a bold statement, but I would say the majority of players would rather have the game not restrict their ability as a human being to input something than be imposed on restrictions. And to me, I like the latter more than the former. Because, yeah, sure, it's well and good that I can push my glass ceiling of my human input things, but it's not intellectually stimulating. You're just basically going to revolve around what you do best or what you decide to do where it is appropriate. Well, I mean, what happens when someone cuts your right arm off? I mean, figuratively, obviously. Or what happens when you literally can't recover from frames? And that's kind of what Yakuza is. And the new modern Kiwami 2 is easily close to the current modern standard. That's just it. And you know what? Here's a deep cut. Yakuza Like a Dragon, Yakuza 8, that the success of it being turn-based, you know, that system being turn-based, it's actually not that different from playing Yakuza. So the bridge between the transition from what Yakuza is for the first 6 games is closer to Yakuza 7's turn-based system than any modern title, in my opinion. Because it is. You take your turn. You wait for your turn to attack. You find what works and what doesn't, and you take your turns. Hey, but the thing is, it's even more literal in Yakuza 8. You literally now take your turns. As opposed to, hey, I'm going to wait and count all these frames. All right, now it's my turn to attack. Like, all right, now we're going to sit here, stare at each other, and we're going to footsie until you attack, so I follow up. That kind of thing. So modern gamers are more like, the vast majority of gamers more like, I want to do something that would work, and I hope there's a clever way of making my way work. Like, well, in Kitty, you just can't do that. Like, you can't do that. You can try to, they do offer a lot of tools that get you close to that, but the system was made not with the idea that, hey, players like to play this way. It's Kiryu is this way. Your character is this way. The city around you and being ganged up on, like 6 people with daggers stabbing you and you're falling over every single time they stab you, that is a street brawl. Like, you are legitimately being oppressed by a gang of people. And that frustration is ironically and thematically appropriate for how sucky it feels to be Kiryu in a street brawl. Like, he is foolhardy. He is foolhardy, reckless, but noble. And he always gets himself into trouble in the craziest situations. And getting stabbed a bunch of times in the back because he decides to pick a fight that you wouldn't rationally pick a fight with. Yeah, I get it. I mean, to me, I get it. I wouldn't want him to do, honestly, here's a big metagame. Imagine Kiryu having infinite dodge rolls and iframes and being able to parry everything because he's like a superhero or something. That would probably take me more out of it than the game it is now. Because he's restricted. He's restricted by his non-perfect fighting form. So I'm okay with that. Like yesterday I was playing like Majima and he kept whiffing on this outrageous slicing move and I was like, you know what? In a way, that's probably what would happen. Like flashy slashing moves that go halfway across the screens, like, yeah, that's not gonna hit very much. So I mean, Majima is Majima. He's a mad dog. So lots of the choices, I think it was unapologetic for theme, and not with the users in mind. So my frustrations almost doubled back on itself, where the frustrations and the little tacky things and whatnot, I don't think it was designed in a manner it's like, well, players feel good about this. It's more like, well, players feel bad about this because it sucks to be in a brawl and you're bringing your fist to a knife fight. With all that said, though, um, Yakuza and future games, and I'm guessing Yakuza in future games too, games are now focusing on accessibility. So, I was watching the interview for Final Fantasy 16, right? And immediately it already said like, hey, we're integrating live combat, right? Live combat into the Final Fantasy game, and it will feature combo rich hack and slash, adjust timing and all that stuff. But at the same time, say, hey, this is an RPG too. If you can't do these block parries and perfect precision dodges and stuff, guess what? In the game, you can go get an accessory that will give you QTE dodging and blocking. It's like, well, okay, then you learn and see all the stuff in slow-mo and stuff. It's like, that's fantastic. It's like, well, if you're really just wanting to enjoy the story and stuff, you can basically just auto dodge. And that's kind of the future of gaming. And I think that is gonna be a lot more intuitive in capturing what Yakuza is trying to do and what FromSoft is trying to do at the same time. So I hope, in my opinion, if developers are cutting some of their budget, right? Like maybe a game is becoming shorter to increase accessibility, I think that's the goal. To reach a compromise between the demands of video gamers. These days, there are incredible number of expectations. Accessibility is key. It's nearly 40%, in my opinion. That's a little bold, but it's 40% of the scores for a reception of a game. Accessibility. What is under accessibility? Well, if it runs well on a lot of people's PCs, that's accessibility. So what happened to Naughty Dog's Last of Us Part 1? It lost 50% because of accessibility. That's it. Like, people's PC stuff crashed. It took longer than they expected. It didn't work on their PC, etc. It's accessibility. What scratched 50% of the score of Wild Hearts, the Team Ninja EA collaboration? No keyboard and mouse controls. I think that was it. Or no. It might be gamepad controls, actually. Wolong was no keyboard and mouse controls. So that just immediately slashed over 50% of the score. So accessibility is in the future, where you get all the choices, but you also get all the restrictions. For me, I'm indifferent. I want the developers to be unapologetic and focus on their vision, but for the future, to breed a successful game is to put forth accessibility first. So I prefer to be frustrated or pleasantly surprised or even bored. Like, if a game I play is unbelievably easy, that's different. If a game is unbelievably ridiculously annoying, that's different. If it's exactly what I expected, I'm apathetic. So I don't want to play, like, for me personally, I don't like playing games that don't elicit anything. That's just spinning the wheel and not learning new things and experiencing new things. So this was a remarkable journey, and it's still gonna go. Like, it's probably gonna take me the rest of the year to complete the Yakuza saga or get caught up. I might be willing to say all the sub stories and all the MSQ will be completed before Yakuza, the guy who erased his name, comes out by the end of the year. Alright, I am looking forward to that. Assassin's Creed, I mean, that's what they're trying to do too, just so you know. Like, you brought up Assassin's Creed, Joshing. Instead of constantly making or focusing on serialized period pieces for Assassin's Creed, they're branching to create the Creed universe, right? They started really early too, to be honest. Yeah, they started really early. Like the early Assassin's Creed game, was that PlayStation 3 or was it? It was PlayStation 3, right? It's actually one of the showcase games. They were working on a universe for a while, but they kind of took a back seat and said like, people weren't really interested in that at the moment because they wanted to connect all the Assassin's Creed through the the metaverse, right? That Assassin's Creed is actually a metaverse. Before uh and what was it? Uh PlayStation 3, right? It was one of the it was one of the showcase titles. Yeah, PlayStation 3. So it wasn't too far off. Although Yakuza was a few years before the whole universe thing. Now people are just creating universes for themselves. So how is it relevant to this game, for example? Well, Fat Shark is delved into GW universe, right? Vermintide and Darktide is indirectly related in the sense that they technically belong to the same universe, the Warhammer universe. And then D&D Direct, so all the D&D games are cross-connecting. So it's crazy now. I would say easily the Yakuza series is one of the most underrated, without a doubt, one of the most underrated franchises to date. Only because it was a product ahead of its time. And ahead of its time as in this time is later than when it came out. Not ahead of its time like it's something all of us want, but it was too soon kind of thing. This was more like if Yakuza was released nowadays, like the publicity and the hype or like the advertisement and stuff, if these games were released in the period now, it would be far more well received because it takes one hook to sell the rest of the games. It takes one Call of Duty to feel almost obligated to buy all the other Call of Duties. It takes one Battlefield. If you like one Battlefield, you are feeling compelled to follow Battlefield forever. So that's kind of the thing. And it also comes with a lot of emotional strength, loyalty, brand, and all that stuff. But the one thing it does far better, in my opinion, than other games in the series right now is it doesn't require to constantly come up with new things for a character that continues to persist. It's still impressive that they did, though. It's still impressive that Kiryu is going to be featured in 7 of 8 Yakuza games. Actually, that's incorrect because he's also featured in the alternative Feudal Japan ones. So technically 9 games. But they don't have to do it. Just like technically the Souls games don't have to feature the same characters. Because it's the universe that makes it persistent. Although, unlike FromSoft, they just go and create something that doesn't have any coherence. I mean, there's a difference between lore and storytelling, and I understand that might be one and the same, but storytelling revolves cohesiveness. They have to check out. Like, it's referential to each other. Lore can be embellishing the world for persistence. It doesn't necessarily have to follow series or checks out in timing and whatnot. So that's kind of a really big deal because it's more flexible for FromSoft than it is for Ryugo and like Final Fantasy. Like Final Fantasy 16, and you know, I'm gonna be really salty and waiting for the PC port, but at the same time, when the PC port happens, I'm probably gonna be waiting even longer because the Japanese companies are still having problems adapting to what largely is Western hardware, like Western software technology and stuff, and that crossover still requires a lot of collaboration and stuff that's not really ironed out. It's safe to say that the growing pains of porting Japanese games that are made for consoles to a firestorm and whirlwind of Western technology and software is a lot of growing pains. In contrast to things like God of War, you know, Montreal, Santa Monica. Oh, sorry, not Montreal. Santa Monica Studios, who are far more culturally ingrained into like PC development and stuff. So that Final Fantasy 16, you know, Square Enix can do whatever because it's more flexible, quote unquote. It constitutes as a series, but it's very flexible. Mario, like when you think about franchises, they're all flexibly non-directly constraining each other. Mario doesn't have to age. They don't have to. Mario doesn't get scarred over and over again. Mario has no persistence. Link has no persistence in their universe. So there are very few games in this world, and Metal Gear Solid was a great example. For whoever mentioned it, and then for Eric personally. It had a persistent universe. Resident Evil technically has a persistent universe, but their characters tend to not have persistent effects. So like while you get the Easter eggs, right? The Easter eggs are a part of the game's mechanics often. They're not a callback. They're not stringing for baggage, right? You can still get like, oh, hey, it's Chris Redfield again and whatnot. It's like, you know, I mean, Leon like dispatched 1,000, like a whole village of people. That didn't really phase him all that much. That kind of thing. So that type of rationality and stuff is sideline for mechanics in the way Capcom approaches things. So that's fine. Like even Sega's own Sonic Team stuff, like Sonic the Hedgehog, like there's no crosstalk or baggage. Witcher on the other hand, like that's why I still think CDPR that's not popular right now, but it's getting more popular. Persistent role-playing games, RPG, not your stats like, oh, this gear has plus 10 or plus 11 and stuff like that. That's the relic, the remains of what role-playing games are. And lots of the criticisms that are mentioned here, like when we're playing Darktides and stuff, or missed opportunities, that's what's missing. It's presenting itself like RPG, but it lacks the sustainability and the persistence of role-playing games. And that is not, it's what kind of Bill highlighted this as the contrasting. I think he's more reflective of the modern day person, where they think of the mechanics, they think about the banters in isolation, not its persistence. So for example, this game, the characters themselves are cookie cutters. They are to make it your character. So he specifically said the attachment is developed by an attachment to your character. That is far, I mean, I don't know if Eric was leaning towards that or not, but if I had to guess, for me and Eric, the thing that compels us most is the role-playing experience. I'd rather play a character's story and live the life of a character that has been written for me than just playing a character that I own and I want, because it's not interesting. Like, I mean, to me, like for example, the last time I checked, I write stories. I tell stories about my life all the time. But the last thing I want to do is play a game that represents me, because I do that every day. Now, here's the contrast. When you contrast to the modern gamer, in my opinion, the vast majority of people, they spend so little time sharing and expressing their life and evaluating their life that it is still interesting to them to create their life and character and likeness in a game. That's just a contrast of the practice. So I empathize with that previously, where it would be fun to own your character. Like, this character is me. I still use the phrase, oh, we or me when I'm playing Kiryu. But technically, when I say me or I'm talking about the player controlling Kiryu. I don't pretend like I am Kiryu. But in most modern games now, the scope and the appearance and the success of the game is depicted by making the main character the person playing the character. So you are no longer playing a story game. Now, what I mean by that, a role-playing game, because you no longer play a literal role in the universe. The universe is designed around you. So I guess in a way you could say your role is to shape the world itself. So in that way, you can say you're playing a role-playing game. But it's not interesting, in my opinion, playing yourself. I mean, even the phrase "play yourself" is kind of weird. But I'm looking forward to seeing what is going to be the new standard. But the difference between playing a game that is like a movie is that typically those games are role-playing games. So if you think you like story and lore and you think your game has a lot of story and lore and stuff, you have to ask yourself, are you the main character? If you are, you're not actually that's far from a story. You're playing you're making the story. You're making your own story. You're not playing a story. You don't play a role in the story. So, yeah, some people might say these games are, oh, it plays more like a movie. Like, oh, like this is, it's like, well, yeah. And that's what part of role-playing games are. So if you don't like role-playing games, that might actually be it. Like, one of the major drivers that the schisms between older gamers, for example, the gamers that grew up in a time of role-playing golden age, which excludes anyone who's around their 20s right now, is statistically likely to be excluded from the RPG golden age. The RPG golden age is that you get to find out how sucky it is to be a character, or how fantastic it is to be a character. Just like when you're watching a movie, playing a visual novel game, the game is supposed to go out of its way, intended to, if they fail to communicate, like if this character is supposed to suffer and have the crummiest time of all time, and if that game failed to compel that, well, the developers failed. It's not saying, hey, one of the fun polls that people do a lot is one of the experiments, social experiments, is like the data that some of the developers get, where they give character creation choices, right? It gives you the choices to create your character, and then they data mine for how many of the gamers would paint them as a superhero who could do everything, or how many people would paint them as a saint who's always doing the right thing over the wrong thing, or what they believe is the wrong thing. And generally speaking, when you're playing a game like that, even spectating the game is boring. Hear me out here. Is boring, but it's interesting at the same time. Where, yes, it confirms what people think of themselves, but it also confirms how lack of understanding they are of themselves. So when we go around, the games are designed in a way it's like, oh, here's the good path, here's the bad path, and how many people get to assume like do the good path, you get through all this, but you can get the bad path to do like this stuff. It's like that stuff is a choose your own adventure game. But usually when you're given the choice, most people have similar experiences. And that's the human condition. They have similar experiences, and that creates communities. It creates communities like the FromSoft community. Every people have selected themselves based on their human condition. I don't resonate with a community like that. I like at all, because I myself as a person don't even resonate with the gaming community at large. So how am I expected, in my opinion, realistically, for example, play a game that the game is designed to make you the main character? Well, if I'm the main character, I am not going to relate to most people already. It's a simulation of your life. You're projecting onto the game. I play a game to leave myself, and that's kind of one of the ironies in video games. When people use that euphemism, like what is the purpose of escapism or video games, is to stop getting reminded of real life, like leave the bounds of real life, be able to do things I can't do. It's like, then why would you play a game where the main character is you? So the game only reminds you of what you do well, what you don't do well, what you avoid, and projects pretty much all the things you know about yourself. So you basically play the game that you think you're learning something mechanically or even intellectually, but it's so diminished. It's capped by your inability to ever leave your own intelligence and your own mechanics. There is a big caveat. Games can be hard enough where it challenges your mechanics to a new ceiling that can give you the reward, like, oh, you've learned something new. For example, you've learned to... The new part is the refinement of something you already know. So when someone tells me they learned something new because they got better at something, that is an oxymoron. When you learn something new, you have no point of reference for a new thing. So you didn't learn overall, you didn't learn something novel. You learn a novel approach. It is still new, but it's not the idea of that thing. It's how you did it better, the method that you did better. So you're kind of interested in the process, which is great, because when you're interested in the process, that's where the refinement is. Well, one of the best processes to learn for a human being who's also the main character in their life are life skills. So if you want a challenge like that, so when someone is playing a video game and say, I only like this video game because it's hard, go practice life skills. You're doing the same thing, like, in my opinion. Fundamentally speaking, if you can translate And I'm saying this in not a, I'm trying not to sound like simplifying it. I'm saying that mentality that you have to constantly refine in a video game is so appropriately applied to life skills that it's uncanny if you can make the translation. But it is not intellectually learning new things. The moment, in my opinion, that realization comes and be appreciated, one can pick up new skills more regularly while being able to discern when they're intellectually learning proactively and actualizing that new thing, and not just refining something that is ultimately spinning the wheel more efficiently. So, for example, you can ride a bike and you're going to learn new ways to get more and more efficient on riding a bike. But making a car is something new. They're both involved in the process of getting from point A to point B, but those are two different processes. So when you, and this violates everything I've said, because I like the Yakuza games, right? Like, I like the Yakuza games. They didn't do that. And it's a first time for me where they legitimately had me invested in something that actually doesn't change. So now it's a game represented by the iteration process, but it's so pure in the iteration process that it is unapologetic. The city is the same. They designed the process of reliving the city every year by introducing nuances. So I technically don't learn very much new things about Yakuza. From each game, you don't have to relearn new things a lot, but that familiarity is how people are learning now. At least how I understand it, and how gamers are now. So when back in the day, when there's this meme, this joke where like, oh yeah, you know, back in the day those games were easy, like gamers of back in the day didn't have complexity and stuff. So like insisting and inferring that the lack of complexity is the reason why games were easier or like harder or whatnot. It's like, well, no, it's just different. It's a different perspective, right? When one can only appreciate the difference between a 0.1% all the time that separates a good player from a weaker player, then that 0.1% has a resolution of 1/10 of a percentage. And then you have another approach. The difference in range is 10%. It's in the tens of percent. Well, that's a magnitude of 100 times. To get the perspective properly, you would have to live in that system. So I chose those two deliberately to say one side is about consistency. The other side is about novelty. When someone learns a new skill, it can vary from being a papega to a prodigy. Every single time a new skill is acquired, you can range from being an intuitive prodigy to the biggest papega the craft has ever known. That's the range. When you think you're learning something new through iteration and consistency, the range could be like you did 1% better than the other person. And that's super great because the variation is low. So if you ever ask yourself, your skills, how much you're learning, how efficient you are, well, here's the trade-off. Here's the objective observation. This is, now we're throwing subjectivity out. Like I already gave subjectivity a fair shake. What's hard, what's not hard, what's hard, what's not hard. That's relative, right? I've given the subjective perspective a shake now. Now let's talk about objectivity. Learning a new skill will incomprehensibly increase one's deficiency like improve one's deficiency astronomically more than one person refining a skill they already know. Like, there's no subjectivity in that. When you can't do something and you learn to do it, is infinitely, objectively infinitely more than someone who learned how to do something better. That's just objective nature. Like, whether it's valuable or not or meaningful to you, we've already discussed that. It depends on the person, right? It's all dependent on the person. So the idea is, it's kind of like that self-help topic that we talked about, Josh. Many of the self-help things are constantly reiterated. The principles and stuff are not new. They are reiterated to help emotional subjectivity become receptive to it. And it increases accessibility, which is like mirrored by the video game community. When video games are more accessible, they enable the influence and the impact of that video game. It doesn't ensure that the video game itself is novel or new. It doesn't impact the objective nature and value of the context itself. So if you can, so objectivity of people's skills, values, knowledge, and stuff, it's often dissonant, like doesn't correlate well with people's emotions. But emotional investment is still the rate limiting step, in my opinion. So in the end, objectivity is quote unquote perceived as easy most of the time, and emotional investment and the subjectivity is the hard part. It's the part that makes easy things feel really hard. And in the end, how much you control and refine that part will enable you to do what may seem like is hard or easy, but those words are purely emotional. So when it comes to like video games and whatnot, so many of the things you do on a video game and its appeal and stuff is transferable to so many other things. It involves the same processes, but the emotional baggage is what creates the resistance. So for example, all the things I said about Yakuza and contrasting it with like the universe building and like a metaverse and its time and space, it didn't change the game itself. Like the game's combat is punishing and whack, like to modern standards. But I can only say that because I understand the emotional state of the majority of modern gamers, in my opinion, at least what I think it is. But the game itself, that type of fundamental and evaluating on that, it's going to be difficult because I'm a human being, right? But the idea is that product itself offers something, and it offers an opportunity to do something that doesn't exist in modern standard very often. So open world game, quote unquote, open world game that tries to encapsulate a persistent city over 2 decades worth of gaming, following 90% of the time, I guess, one character compellingly enough, and then filling up with 7 or 8 pastimes as completionist tasks. Those are objective truths about the game. And then if you look at those objective truths, how many games do that? Well, I can tell you there's a subgenre of games that can do that, but not at the scale of this game with the entire package. So this game is objectively so underrated. And the reason it's underrated is the emotional take of it. It is not, it was a game out of its time. And I think if people were to rate it again, these games would be higher. And it kind of shows because the Yakuza 0 and Like a Dragon, like 8, right? Or 7, they did well. They did super well. In fact, Yakuza Like a Dragon was nothing like Yakuza 0, and it still was well received. So, and far less well received than the previous iterations. So these games are going to get updated and whatnot. That's why they went through like Kiwami 1 and Kiwami 2 and remastered. But emotionally, that's it clouds. It can elevate you, it can diminish you, but in the end, difficult things just it still comes down to what your mindset is, relatively speaking. What is I can't even read. There are so many emotes now that I can't even interpret this. Oh, this is waiting for a self-help book or reading self-help holy books for maximum effort. I don't know what that would be like. Waiting for a self-help book or reading self-help books for maximum effort. Does it need to be maximum effort? Guide to picking and preparing yourself to read. You're starting to it sounds like books for dummies, kind of. Excessive like books for dummies kind of things. Doing the task to do the task. It's hard, but the idea is obligating yourself, right? How do you obligate yourself? I obligate myself by looking for novelty. Reflecting is hard. Yeah. The closest thing I can get to reflecting is hard is reflecting can be exhausting. Sometimes I do feel that exhausting is being used synonymously with difficulty. Joshing. So there is a subtle difference between them. However, in the end, they both contribute to what most would struggle with, which is the perception of effort. Yeah, honestly, you have the answers there. Obviously, here's the thing, right? Here's the goat. If you reflect, and you would be able to answer most things, right? You would be able to answer things with questions. If you know what I mean. Reflection provides both answers and questions. So, if you don't know the answer, you have the answer to the question that you have to answer for the answer in the first place. I say answer too many times. But what I mean is reflection can promote questions that will help you find the answer. So in a way, it is the answer. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. That's obligating yourself to planning. So like for example, why you get up and you wait, am I stealing this quote? Someone said this quote earlier, right? Oh yeah, that guy said this quote earlier. If you can answer why is just if you can answer why, you can answer any how with whys. So if you reflect on why you're doing something and you can answer that, the how is just uh like why is epistatic to how. So if you're asking yourself, why am I writing this down? If you can answer that, it makes figuring out how almost irrelevant. Like what I mean by irrelevant is it's still important, but the difficulty of doing that is what. So like, why do I not have the answer or solution to this? Well, you can answer that. So that will give you how you should or want to answer the problem or address the problem. So it's nice to know that it obligates you. Um, Kind of like this game sucks. For example, like I could say, man, grinding grinding that for example, grinding the money, right? The Coliseum points for the completion points. Or it's like, why am I even doing this? I know I will eventually do it. Why do I want to do it? It's like, well, I asked myself that I wanted to record this stuff for posterity. So I wanted to know how efficient I can get and how much more I can squeeze out in the process. So therefore, I'm still going to do it. So when someone asks like, why bother? Why don't you just use cheat engine, uh, or use a save and you'll eventually get it? It's like, well, if I don't do the process, I'm not taking in the information that would otherwise be there. And I can explain to you all the potential things I can learn from literally doing it than presuming that I could do it. He who has a why to live or can bear, yeah, almost anyhow. So, um, there was a time when I said things like, oh yeah, I'm a completionist, right? I told myself that I'm a completionist, but what does that mean? It probably, um, this is the why part. When people call themselves like, oh yeah, I'm a completionist, I 100% everything, it's like, why do you do that? And actually, what does that mean, right? I call myself a completionist because I want to literally experience completing the process. Not if I succeed or not. I can actually fail in trying to achieve that thing. And multiple times I've already did that. Like I didn't get Rhythm Sprouts achievement. But the process and doing it told me where my limits are at the moment or where I want to cut the limits. If you presume that you always behave the same, you have no room for growth. So for example, you can tell yourself, which you, sorry to put you on the spot, Josh, but you do this, where like, I did this play already in Osu. That's done. I could always do it again if I feel like it. That's not how a person who knows why and how would really suggest that. So, as a completionist, I do not say I'm completing it for the one take. As a completionist, I'm saying I'm trying to do all of it. I'm not expecting to do all of it. The why for me is how I'm doing it. So the whole idea is I know why I'm doing it. I want to learn how I'm going to end up doing it. And that quote there is intertwined. My wow, my why, my why is how. Yeah, it's about the journey. Unfortunately, okay, here's a big deal, right? There's a lot of things we're assuming here. I have resources, so let's not forget that. Before anyone like go and find the worst case scenario or the ultimatums, like, but what if you don't have enough time? Or what if you don't have enough money? It's like, well, if you're asking why for how, you wouldn't get to a position where you would do something without resources. Because if you understand how, I mean, if you understand wow, I keep saying, if you understand why, you probably also understand how to do that thing to the extent where you're probably accepting to know that within given reason that you would do these things. So, for example, I'm going to try to complete this game in 3 hours when no one has. Like, well, okay, why do you want to do that? Because no one has done it. Okay, how are you going to do it? It's like, I don't know. No one has done it. Like, okay, that sounds great. So, since no one has done it, I imagine you know that there's a chance you can't do it. Right? So, that's kind of the idea. You go down the list of things, right? That's um that the example that I picked specifically is the mentality that pretty much any Zoomer has, in my opinion. The vast majority of Zoomers. That's their rationale. Why are you doing this? Because no one has done it before. That's the mentality. Okay. So how are you going to do that? Like, well, I just do what this person did and what this person did. It's like, but you just said why. You said you're going to they did it. You want to do this because no one has done it. So your how to do it is by basing off people who have not done it? like for example, here's a good example, and obviously we love Osu, right? We're Osu gamers. Um, how do I improve in Osu? Well, I want to be the best. It's like, okay, so how are you going to be the best? It's like, well, I'm just going to watch a bunch of people and do what they do, or base my entire regiment and stuff and imitate the best. It's like, so you want to be the best, but you're basing it on the best. And it's not, I'm not saying it won't get the person to improve. That was not the why. That was not the why. If the why was, oh, why do you want to be the best? Like, well, I want to improve in Osu. That's a different story. But that's only when you ask yourself. It's like, why are you playing Osu like this? It's like, I want to be the best. Okay, so how are you going to do it? And then often the how, when people are asking the how, it doesn't fulfill why. So even if you get why, I get it. Like, I'm trying to be argumentative or contrarian. The why does lead you to asking how, and it helps you answer hows. But you have to make sure it's concordant, right? And having a why does prevent you, usually, from making hows that don't help your whys. So, like, why am I having this conversation with you and no one else, right? Like, or why am I ranting right now? What is this idea? Well, my why is I want to become more well versed in expressing this idea about this topic in a medium that involves using my voice and then delivering it in a manner that isn't very indecisive, using words like, for example, over and over again, or so that is my why. How am I going to do it? Well, sometimes it's as simple as, hey, I just need to do it less. How am I going to achieve that? Well, doing the literal task tends to be a great place to start. So I do that. And that's where you start a lot of times. So how do you start being a better record keeper? Or why do you want to start record keeping? Well, I want to remember things I might forget. How do I do it? Start record keeping. And then that leads to other things. But you know, their why is the achievement, not the journey, so it's not in their control. Yeah, it's not in their control. It's unfortunate. Um, it's not a setup for failure though. I want to give a clarity. When someone wants to be the best, it's not a setup for failure. One has to reflect by asking whys and hows over time to know and understand that perhaps their whys are not lining up with their hows. That's generally what I'm trying to encourage, because and that goes back to reflection, self-reflection. Like you what is a great phrase? I read this earlier uh when I was watching Sun. When someone does an action, right? And you do it all the time. You keep doing it. You do it to the point where you go numb. When you have that phrase, when you hear yourself, in my opinion, here's a hot take. Here's a hot take. If you ever either tell someone, write something in this manner, or even think this manner, you have not been self-reflecting long enough. And what I mean by this is when you say, yeah, I really hate this. Like it's always sucky. It's to the point where I just don't care anymore. You stop self-reflecting on it. You have become numb to the issue. So you've accepted the issue. Now acceptance breeds comfort, but it's also coping. So it does breed comfort, and you have to ask yourself, does it detract from your life, right? When you find people that are dumb, right? Like you consider dumb. So if someone is like, oh, these people are dumb and they're annoying and they're always like that, does that make you less happy overall? Like, does that actually destroy you? Well, if it does, over time, why does it do that? And then how are you going to change it? So if you're phrasing that, the idea is you didn't reflect on it enough, in my opinion. So like, oh, I hate to do this, but I don't want to do this. It always happens the same way. It's like, you know why? If you ask yourself why and how this is happening, in my opinion, if you're as competent as you say you are and you're a human being, you'll come to realize it's a you problem. But that would be non-constructive. That's a non-constructive. Like if I went up to someone and say, that sounds like a you problem, and legitimately just walk away, that's a non-constructive criticism. That's a really, if the person is struggling, that's probably the last thing I would say, in my opinion. I like the tough love approach, right? Sounds like a you problem. The idea is you ask the person, why are you upset? Why do you think all people are dumb and annoying? And then the person would probably say, because they didn't reflect on it, they didn't reflect on it too much. The person will say like, I just don't like them. They're like always in the way. It's like, but why is that annoying to you? Like, well, because, you know, they didn't go and say, well, because, for example, here's a deep cut. What, to me, a person who is trying to affirm something to help them is that I would like to infer that this person is egotistical and a narcissist, right? That's not a bad or a good thing. I know it's stigmatized, but you have to confirm this. So I would ask the person, okay, so why do you think these people are dumb and annoying? It's like, well, you know, they get in the way of me doing my task. And so what I'm hearing is they are affecting your semblance of productivity, right? And the person's like, well, yeah, okay. Well, it's not, I'm not on the marks. Like, explain, like, tell me why. So the usual case, the most line of reasoning, they would list all the things those people could inconvenience this person. Like, well, you have thought about it. You kind of thought about the how, though, like how they're going to annoy you. And, you know, like what happens, they skipped a step a lot of times where they're listing all the examples of how these people are dumb and annoying to you. But rarely does it ever get to the why. So this person would say like, oh, you know, they could get in the way and I'm like driving a car. They could like just inconvenience me in every way. Or if I drive down, it's always crowded and people walk so slow. And it's like, okay, so what I'm hearing is how they annoy you. But have you asked yourself, why do they ignore you? And you might be thinking, well, that's how you answer it. Like, that's why they're annoying. It's like, well, actually, the bigger why, and here's the deep cut, is you only care about yourself in this situation. That's why it annoys you. Like, you want to get there as fast as possible without other human beings interacting with you. You dislike public interactions and things that get in your way or increase your time. That's why. So how are you going to solve that? How are you going to get there, do that thing with less annoyance by dumb people? How are you going to do that now that you know why, in my opinion, right? This is the most likely case. This is why it's annoying. Well, the first thing would be is to avoid as many people as possible. How are you going to do that? So in the future, and I'm telling you this just as a remark because I've had this exact sentiment when I was younger. When I was 18 to like 21, I had the same inward how, why question all the time. Like, I don't want to drive in New York City because there are a lot of traffic everywhere. There are a lot of people and whatnot. It's no longer the case. Like, okay, well, I know the rules. I know the details. Okay, well, one of the things I've done before, and it's not New York specifically, it's any city because I used to live in a city, in 3 different cities. For example, I go home, I leave the city unbelievably early. And then I arrive back at the city unbelievably late. And no, I no longer have that irrational belief that people are annoying and dumb because they inconvenience me. Because that is not true. That is what you want to believe is true. That people are dumb and annoying. When practically anyone there is probably have the capacity to think the exact same thing about you. So what does that gain? What does that gain? It gains perspective. It helps you solve your problem. And because of that, you can use it to your advantage. So what I mean is, it placed a ball in your court. It gave you an answer that you can control because the why is about you, not about the people you can't control. You can't control someone getting in your way. You can't control, well, you can technically, but what I mean is serendipitously, right? Like, you can't control where those people live at the moment you're about to do it. I mean, if you're a dictator and something like that, or like some superhero person, or like a millionaire or billionaire, that's besides the case, right? If you're like those people, the how and why is about you. You're making excuses that are externalized, and it involves more variables about things you can't control. Why does this game annoy you? Because you're playing it. Not really. That's the how thing. It's more like, why is this game annoying? And then you have to ask, what is an annoying game to you? And then the how is easy, right? Easier, because if you know why a game is annoying to you, and the game you're playing literally is the stuff you're annoyed, that's how it's annoying you. So that's kind of the thing, right? But if you know why, sometimes it gets you to do things that you otherwise feel differently. For example, why get up in the morning and brush your teeth? Why do you do it? The how is pretty easy, and you can probably jump over why to do it, but it's worth asking why. It's nice to reflect and ask yourself from time to time. Things become automated, observations become automated, presumptions become habit forming. Honestly, waiting for the day manga just leaves. Oh, what do you mean? What point? Oh, yeah, okay. Sounds like a you problem. Just leave it as that. Okay. So, um, that's what I mean by self-reflection. I think it's really relevant in the way. So just ask yourself why. That's a great self-reflection. I don't think it's the whole picture. Like, I don't think that's just it, but it's a great starting point. You wake up, you do something, or you plan something, or anything in general. Ask yourself why, not how, and then make sure to ask yourself: Am I answering how, or am I answering why? So, for example, uh I'm eating vegetables. Why am I eating vegetables more often? And then someone would answer is like, uh, you know, because vegetables promote healthy, healthy things. And then you ask how, right? And then most people just skip over how, okay, because it's too much effort, or it's just assumed, right? Or the other way is, um, instead they're more concerned about how to do it. So eating vegetables, how do I do that? So I have to go to the grocery store, then I have to cook it. It doesn't, probably not going to taste that great, or now I have to like buy stuff. It's like they're more concerned with that, and they never ask themselves why over time. Like, oh, I'm eating this all the time, day in, day out. It's like, man, this sucks. And then in the end of the day, they haven't asked themselves why they're doing it. Because if you did ask your why, in my opinion, if you constantly reminded yourself why you're doing it, it will reinforce the idea of why you did it in the first place, and it can empower you to do it. It does suck. Like, for example, the how would be like, oh, I should stop because it sucks. But why are you doing it? I'm trying to get healthier. And there's a lot of points where when you start doing something for so long, you've forgotten why you do it in the first place. That's to the point where someone has lost self-reflection, or they have not reflected enough anymore. So when you ask yourself, man, why are you crushing your fingers into two keypads to play a rhythm game? Someone would say, because I love this game. Right? Like, someone would say, or when you try to, it works empathetically too. It works when you're talking to someone as well. Someone would say like, oh, I do this. This is an important job to me. Thank you. Why are you clicking heads and killing pixels? Yeah. So, here's one that helps in externalize. So it does help with empathy as well, in my opinion. Because when you're comfortable with your own perception, it gives you time to think about other people's perception. For example, someone would say, man, why would anyone do this? It's so dumb. Like, this, why would they ever run around in DC on legs while I need to drive through it? Like, well, if you lived in DC, Ask yourself, why would you be running around in DC? And it would be very ironic for the person to realize, like, people run around and ride bikes is because they're avoiding or mitigating the very problem that you're complaining about. And understanding that empathy allows one to appreciate other human beings. So not only, like, it's kind of, I don't want to say all of this follows each other and it happens overnight, but when you alleviate it, it's all connected. So I'm not saying all these things, they're not done in isolation, but it is a great starting point to focus on something in isolation. So record keeping is often a great first step, but for someone who is way past that, I can tell you the reason why I suggest record keeping is so much more than what I can explain to you now. But the thing is, if you do it, I don't have to explain it to you anymore. If it's successful, you would become maybe something like me, who started that journey 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where I thought the same thing. Like, what's the point of hearing my own voice? I still, like, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I told myself, like, I hate listening to myself. Like, in seminars, I hate hearing recordings of myself. What's the point? I already know what I said, right? Like, I already know I feel terrible about it. What's the point of going over my interview after my interview is done? Like, it's already over and done. Like, what's the point of reflecting on those things? That's no longer the case anymore. I have reflected on things so much that it is very difficult for me to forget certain things. However, I still record keep for all the things that I don't remember, because I cannot earnestly tell myself that I'm trained in everything where I can remember everything that happened. I remember things that I reflect on the most, hence the most important things, and the record keeping helps me with the others. So in fact, I actually record keep on the least important things that come natural to me. And that's what record keeping is. It's helping you work on skills you absolutely suck at. And it could be record keeping itself being the sucky skill. Like, record keeping is legitimately a novel skill for most people in this day and age, where it's to the point where even technology that automates some of these things still does not stop someone from failing, in my opinion, from failing to exercise record keeping or budgeting or planning. I know budget is a form of planning, but things like that. And the challenge, the asking a why, like, even you can even use why on why someone else is asking you this. Like, if you want to get at the root of a question, someone is angry at you. You can ask yourself, why is this person angry at me? And how am I going to deal with that? That kind of thing. It goes so deep, but the mechanics, the objective mechanics are easy. Like, what I mean is easy to understand. That's kind of what that author was getting at. The objective instructional things are easy to understand and largely not new. They are objective for that reason. We use objectivity to simplify and remove the complexity of emotional baggage. However, the task is deceptively hard because of emotional baggage, or emotional input. So, yes, record keeping, it sounds trivial on paper. Objectively, it's like, oh yeah, just write the thing down. Like, write your favorite thing every day. Write your favorite moment every day. and then like share it with someone. Just tell someone your favorite moment. Like the tomorrow task. Tell someone what you wrote down yesterday as your favorite thing yesterday. And then you just repeat that 30 times. Like, what's the point? Like, it's so easy. You just write it down. It's like, oh, I think I smiled today. Great. I'll just tell someone I smiled today. I mean, they probably don't think it's a big deal or something. But yeah, because that person you're talking to probably has the same lack of empathy and self-reflection that you have. But the idea is you're asking yourself, why? And if you ask yourself why, you'll probably phrase it in a way that is not dependent on how that other person reacts. Like your why is not, I'm record keeping because I want someone else to be interested in my record keeping. That's not the why, right? That's the incentive. Like if that person just happens to be interested in like, oh, you smiled yesterday. What did you smile about? Like that's great. That's an extra bonus, but it's not part of why. But it enables you to do that. Your why is I'm doing this because I'm developing a new habit. That's a reason. Like I'm developing a new habit. Is there any other why? Well, don't know. But once you get to how it affects you over time, you might go back and ask yourself, well, now why do you do it? Well, I learned this and that, so I'll continue to do it. And then how am I gonna and it's like maybe I'll add more things. Well, how am I gonna do that? So that's how you build, right? You build over time your record keeping. And for me, record keeping is of all the things I will forget. And that sounds like, well, duh, don't you write the things that you forget? It's like, well, actually, I'm gonna tell you now, most people write the things they remember. I kid you not. The vast majority of things that people record keep and write down are the things that they think are important and are the things they are more likely to remember, not less likely to remember. Now, that doesn't mean they won't forget those important things. Generally speaking, record keeping just means, you record as many things as possible. But the logic they use is they're going to record things that they're afraid to forget, not the things that they are more likely to forget. So, for example, when you're studying for an exam, what do you try to remember? Well, you try to remember the general understanding of the concept. What do you write down in your notes? The specifics that you would probably forget. But as long as you have those, you already have the general understanding. That's one of the biggest hallmarks, in my opinion, of the difference between an effective note taker and one that is trying to strap themselves silly. So here, the reason why this approach is effective is because it's not a specialized skill. Someone who can write what they're possibly going to forget to complement what they already know is applicable to most everyone, unless you have a learning disability, which we're not talking about outliers. So it's not, oh, if you're smart, you take notes of everything. Or if you're smart, you just remember everything and don't take notes at all. Those are extraordinary cases. The idea of note-taking is to write down things you're about to forget. The hard things, the specific things that have no context except for your understanding. So when you understand a concept, you write the specifics to the concept. You don't remind yourself typically the concept that you already understand. So sometimes it would be you say in the 90s, right? Like for example, what's a generalization? Like in the 90s, RPG games were very popular. What would I write down in my notes? Titles of RPG games that are in the 90s, because there's a great chance I will not remember those specifics, but but I can at least remember the conceptual understanding that I'm trying to gather. And that type of thing can be reverse engineered. What is the reverse engineer? That's research. Research is the reverse engineer of what I just said, maybe with a lot of hand waving. So research is you ask, what is the general idea that I need to know? And where and what should I find and write down for it? So you find all the specifics that will get to your general idea, which happens to be a hypothesis driven thing, which has some no-nos and stuff, because then it has to go to a second refinement period where you refine and say, is the thing, are the evidence that I found really, like, what are the alternative things? So you go through it again. But that's kind of the idea. You create an idea, you find specifics. And that's kind of what record keeping is too. So like, what do I know that I'm going to forget when I run every day? The very specific amount of time that I take to run the runs. Not because I went running, not because I wanted to get healthy, and honestly, probably not really how I run or how I'm feeling, even, because in general sense, even the specific time would give me that idea already. Because if you analyze the data of your time, you'll probably gather a pretty clear picture of it. But that's not to say you can't record it, because like it might just take a few seconds, right? The alternative way is, oh, I don't have time to record how I feel. Why don't you? It's like, well, it's really hard to describe. It's like, well, how are you gonna make it less? How are you gonna simplify it? Use a Likert scale, 1 through 10. Use a number scale. So if you don't have enough time and the effort to write down, I'm sad or not feeling exactly, simplify it. That's how you. Why is it so frustrating and hard to describe your emotions each day in record keeping? Well, it has a lot of words and it takes up a lot of time, and I just don't feel like I have enough time for that. It's like, well, how are you going to simplify it then? Well, you simplify it. Start by reducing sad to a 1. Or a 1 minus, and then use minus as a, like, I'm timid. So optimizing, right? It helps. And it all comes down to all the relational things. And no, not to me. I don't want to give you the impression that there's like a life hack where it comes down to like the 5 glowing principles of life skills that impacts 90% of your thing. It's more like everything's related. So start with the one you can do. Like, what I mean is, you might think doing something like sneezing over, no, that's the bad, like cleaning the floor is just cleaning the floor. But with proper self-reflection, application, and commitment to the process, you can elevate that to many other things. It's just at the moment expecting yourself to have the foresight of a Time Lord is unrealistic, but it doesn't stop so many people from using that logic where I'm not going to do this because I know I'm not going to like it. So it's just a waste of time. You're acting as a Time Lord. That's all I'm saying. It's my euphemism, but yeah, you're perceiving yourself as an omnipotent person. And number one of the classic characterizations of the human condition, hindsight is 2020. So yes, it can suck, and it is very scary, and it has unknown consequences. But that's the joy of, in my opinion, I know there's anxiety and insecurity. But remember, when you try something, it can be super bad, but it can also be super good. It can be, but here's the thing. Based on your perspective, it can always be super meaningful. It can be bad. It can be good. It can be disinteresting. It can be boring. It can be exciting. But the one thing you have control over is that it can have meaning. You, and now I'm starting to sound like a motivational. It takes a lot of effort and planning and training and practice, but you are the controller of the meaning of the actions, like the trying and the stuff. So if something bores you to death, it can still have meaning. Throwback to 99% of gamblers quitting before that. Yeah. So yes, I I say things like, I still say things like, this is dumb, this is stupid, and I'm getting emotional about it. It's like, but that's the best part now I'm looking forward to. Like, I actually look forward to these things because one of the trade-off is I can't empathize with people who stop doing things because they're afraid it can be a negative experience to them. And it can be a positive experience or something they're not expected. That is diminishing opportunities. So what is a success? One of the prominent success, points of success and human dynamics and like positivity or whatever the stuff, it gets repackaged and recoined and like the terminology gets swapped up again. It's the idea that you don't take opportunities. The more opportunities you negate by excusing yourself, the lack of change you'll have. And if your life sucks right now, the last thing you want to do is reduce the opportunities. If your life doesn't suck and you're on cloud 9, all the power to you. Keep going. Like, go for it. If you're ever in that position, which I don't usually talk to people in that position, I don't even talk to myself like that in that position, because I'm constantly thinking I have things I can solve and improve. If I don't have that, I won't bother getting up anymore. Like, if I believe that the world is filled with 99% healthy people and no one needs help, I wouldn't get up anymore. Like, I would basically just sit here and sulk in the corner because I wouldn't have a purpose anymore, right? Like, that is my purpose. I feel I get up to see people in trouble, to learn from them and offer whatever I can, right? Like, indirectly or however, that provides me with a reward. So if you're like the Chad and you have everything and do everything, that's great. Like, it would be wonderful, ironically, in a way that I would suffer, but I'm willing to suffer out of boredom and disinterest in my life if everyone had the luxury of saying, yeah, I don't need to change anything because I'm just chill. Like, I've got everything packed emotionally, physically. Like, that's great, but that's not the human condition, right? We already know the human condition is self-defeatist. Like, the moment someone says what Fictitious is joking about, the moment someone says I'm perfect, they lose motivation. Like, you stagnate. And the human condition, I mean, there are people out there, I would say like 2 or 3% in the world who thinks they're perfect, and they are perfect. Like, they think they're perfect and are perfect. 2% is generous, maybe like 0.01%. They're perfect and think they're perfect. That's great, right? But the human condition is, when you become perfect, you strive for more perfection. Like, when you obtain perfection, there is a greater perfection. The human condition, understanding that, is that the human constantly strives for more, typically. And someone who ever reach closer to perfection, they tend to be one of those people who strive for more. And so, but there are rare cases. There are rare cases where people made it, fulfilled everything in their life, and they spiral into depression, listlessness, motivation to live. Like, because there aren't any more goals. There aren't any more tasks. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're not part of the 0.01%, I actually do not envy individuals who have reached a state where they have no motivation or no desire to strive for anything else. So if you're in that 0.01%, well, I probably wouldn't be talking to you anymore, right? Because you're living in a unreachable state. In the case of everyone else, that's the idea. Being afraid, like, if your life is not in a great place, it's just, I need change. The last thing you want to do is close as many doors as possible by avoiding it. And when you avoid it, I don't mean avoiding it doesn't make you feel better. Like, it does. Avoidance behavior alleviates insecurities, like the anxiety, things that are in your way. But you have to know, while it makes you feel better, for sure, absolutely, and it's easier, probably subjectively, generally, it's easier to avoid and walk away from things. It is closing exponentially more doors than avoiding it, generally speaking. Sometimes less so, but still significant, because this is a judgment call. These are subjective things. You can still avoid things and open new doors, right? So avoiding things can open new doors. It's just, if I had to say statistically, doing the inaction overall will likely open less opportunities than being proactive. And avoidant behavior removes control from you than proactive ones. So these are some acceptable objective truths that are not subjectively interpretable. When you avoid something, you are not changing something. When you are proactive, you are likely to change something. And then that change could more often offer more opportunities than not changing anything. So those are things that you can rely on. They are truths. They are objective truths. So if you're worried about trusting your own feelings, right? You're worried about the lack of clarity. You're sad and you don't know what's working, what's not. There are certain truths, objective truths, that can provide clarity. And one of them, and I don't want to say this is a life hack or anything, because this is deep cut. It's a lot of new things. Avoidant behavior tends to be the lesser of the two. So willingness to do something that reminds you of how much a failure you are is still likely to provide more meaningful things than not doing it at all and still think you're a loser. Like, think about the two options, right? Like, if you're looking at the phrasing, right, you get to choose. I'm afraid to do this because I will get rejected, instead of doing it and getting rejected. So on the one case, you are guaranteed to feel like a failure. On the other case, you have no idea what the outcome is. And yes, it comes with anxiety, insecurity, but it still comes with an additional opportunity, multitudes of opportunities. The other way, you're predestined. No way yeah. So, and in a way, depending on your personality and stuff, there's more to this, right? The avoidance could prevent you from spiraling further. Absolutely. So if you don't get rejected and you try to find a scenario that you're less likely to get rejected, that's acceptable. That's absolutely acceptable. So for example, now we are adding time to it. So you can be avoidant till it's in your favor. I do this quite a lot. Like, I try my best when I know my best is way more than sufficient to do something. So that would mean that I am more likely to succeed, and that would put the favor in my odds. Absolutely. So you can use that approach, but you also have to remember you have lost all the opportunities that you have avoided up to that point. And it can be okay for you. It can be okay for other people. You have to remind yourself that is why you're doing it, though. Most people think of it as, I'm avoiding this because I'm a loser. I'm avoiding this because I would have gotten rejected. It's like, well, you wouldn't know if you have gotten rejected because you didn't do it. So why are you avoiding it? You're not avoiding it because you're going to get rejected. You're avoiding it because you're afraid of rejection. There are two different things, right? Being afraid of rejection doesn't mean you would get rejected. You didn't get rejected. So that's kind of the idea. You're skipping the step, right? So that's kind of what I mean. Sometimes it's better to play it safe than it is not. But here's the meta to that. Playing it safe is often referring to a point of no return. But most of our life decisions is like, they're learning experiences. They're not a point of no return. Like, death is a point of no return, and I get it. Better play it safe than, falling off a cliff. I get that. Like, and that might sound like, oh yeah, that's simple. Well, those are objective stuff, right? Those are objective. But now we're talking about emotional stuff, which is like 90% of your decision making is involved in emotional stuff. So 90% of the time you're using that same logic. We're like, oh, I know what's going to happen. Obviously, I know what's going to happen. So therefore, I'm going to make my decision based on what obviously is going to happen. I think I'm a person who reflects every month, every week, sometimes every 2 weeks. And I still don't think that when someone asks me, hey, have you ever done this? It's like, no, I haven't. And then my first thought would be, well, I probably know what's already going to happen. So maybe I won't bother doing it. Like, no, I still do it knowing that I know what would happen. And if it happens that way, then yeah, I knew what was going to happen. But guess what? It only reinforces how much I know about myself. That's it. Like, it's not a waste of time to reevaluate your evaluation, like to get an actual evaluation of your reevaluation. So every time you're affirmed, like, I did this play, and you go back and do the play again, it's a reaffirmation of your evaluation. So when someone says, oh, I can never stream 120 BPM, I can never stream 140 BPM, like, that's too slow now. Like, it doesn't matter anymore. It's like, I'm describing that kind of person. And they can be perfectly happy with that. Absolutely. But when they say, it doesn't make sense for me to do it, that's their shortcoming to me, not my shortcoming. I have no shortcomings in this one. Mine involves encompassing their perspective and my perspective. We are both happy, but their perspective does not include mine. Mine includes theirs. But both of us could be mutually happy and mutually indifferent to each other. That's fair. Like, it's fair game that they don't think being able to stream 120 in OSU is important, or being streamed, but that's their game, and they look like they're happy. If they're sad and angry at me for doing something that they don't do before, it doesn't. My first question is, why did you stop in the first place? And then the person would ask, like, well, why are you doing it? It's like, because of people like you. And that's not like a jab at them. It's like I'm doing this because I want to inspire people and remind people of doing things not of taking things not for granted. For example, so I do things in weird ways, in slow ways, in fundamental ways because I probably do things people don't do, but they still do. Like for example, or they forgot that they still do. Like being mindful is what I mean. I do things mindfully. Most people nowadays, in my opinion, are better for it. They're more efficient. They make decisions faster. I don't make decisions quickly. I make decisions very slowly. What is that like? Well, most people don't know what that's like anymore. In fact, the most consistent most consistent experience I've ever had when I ever show how I do something, like literally show them how I do something, you either lose attention, like they just stop listening halfway through. They ask me, what's the point? Why am I doing it? It's like, that doesn't make sense. That's how it goes. And I'm not here to convince them otherwise. My goal, why am I doing this, is not to convince people that my way is important. My why is that I'm doing this so that other people can see it. That's fine. It so people can see it. I can still do their process, you know, like, oh yeah, you're right. That's very great. Like, that's awesome. Like, I'll try it next time, maybe. You know, like I'll give it a go if I have time and whatnot. But remember that you're doing what a lot of people are doing. It's like that's great, but sometimes that's not important to me. So that's fine. Like I take inspiration from other people, but obviously I do it slowly and adapting because I'm not that person. So like if I see someone doing certain things, I'm going to do that person's thing my way because I'm not that person. There's no way that's going to work out the same way. Like there's is so astronomically unlikely that when you see someone do something and you decide I want to do exactly that and get the same results, that is so naive, but at the same time it can provide the source of happiness for very motivated people to do. But the objective truth is by the time they do all of that, it will turn out to be something different, like slightly different in some way, because it's their way. Humans don't have telepathy and perfect empathy, and they are not born with the same exact identical situations and circumstances and physical, physical and mental capacity. So the idea is you take inspiration from that person, and the ability to take inspiration and integrate it to your process is the idea. It's the goat, if you will. It's the thing that all the skills we practice is trying to harness. You're trying to integrate everything you learn as much as you can. If you compartmentalize your life skills, it can provide happiness. It can provide clarity. It can provide coping mechanisms. Once you become stable, like once you're great at coping, you can stabilize. Becoming enlightened means that you stop compartmentalizing. You start looking at more complex interactions. So the idea is we cope by simplifying things. We cope in science, like science is kind of coping. Like when something is too complicated, we compartmentalize. But the goat is once you understand the compartmentalized stuff, you keep getting bigger. You keep stepping back. It keeps getting more complex. You start looking at all the bigger picture. So when you're able to do that, you're constantly pushing your envelope and trying to, constantly pushing the boundaries of how you see the interconnection. So like one of the comments you made earlier about my comment about Yakuza and world building and then connecting it with the MCU and the metaverse constructing thing, It's just my scope of video games are bigger than just a game series. And that's just it. Like my interest is broader, right? But the thing is, there's also a trade-off. I don't know specifics either. So like the specifics I named are the things that I remember. Now, hopefully, with enough discussion and a lot of other people, they would provide more specifics. Like it could go beyond Disney. It could be someone's favorite comic book series for all I know. The idea is that I am not saying I know all the specifics. I just have a broader scope. So when you get broader, you get less specific, right? That sounds like, did I just define broader? No, not really particularly. Like what I mean by that is the human perception. So the more general you become, you sacrifice specialty. But the idea is you're pushing the envelope of how many specific things you can learn. So I know a lot of specifics, but then I try to connect all of them and they become broader. So the time I spend doing that, I'm using broad strokes. And I often try to tell people that I'm lacking specifics. I'm going to forget those things. And often to alleviate that, I write them down. So anytime I tell people like I haven't formed a proper, a proper essay or a proper writing thing, is because I haven't practiced it and I haven't written any of it down yet. So when someone asks me something current, I would say, yes, from what I know, I haven't done my research enough or enough to be coherent, and the like. Yeah, because you don't have to write down things you're gonna remember. So it's kind of, here's the experiment, right? To me, I don't think this is what most, I can't speak for other people who do self-help things. When you're record keeping, the idea is, yes, it's important to remind yourself of what's important. But here's the thing. If you don't write the important thing to you down and you forget it, it's not important to you. I'm just saying. Like, if objectively speaking, like logically, objectively speaking, when you start record keeping and you say, what's not important to me? I should write those things down. And when you write those things down and those things become meaningful to you over time, you might not need to write them down anymore. But you don't know that yet. You don't know what you think is not important can be valuable to you yet. So when you're record keeping, you are writing specific things down you know you're going to forget because you don't think it's important. And then those things that you said, oh, they're important, I'll remember it. And then you forget it, start writing them down because they're not important enough for you. That's what I mean. So when you say, oh, I'll remember how I feel. This is, by the way, this is an objective truth. It's not a subjective truth. Except for like super, super gifted people. When someone says, I know exactly how I feel about this, that's not true. That's not how our memory works. There's no memory that can adequately compensate for reliving an event emotionally. So when you say, I don't need to write this down, I know it sucked, that is not true. You will forget. Like, that's just how biology works. Like, that's how our memory works, at least for the time being. It's very, very unlikely that you have an autobiographical emotional memory where when you say, if you ever say like, oh, I know this game sucks because I remember exactly how it feels when it sucked when I played it the first time. So therefore, I didn't write anything down to indicate that, like exactly how sucky it was. That is incorrect. And that's a fallacy, in my opinion, that many people challenge themselves to do. So things like, how did I feel today? Well, I generally always feel like a 5. Just do an exercise. Ask yourself, write down the numbers every day when you write down and see if you wrote down a 5 every single day. And then you'll ask yourself, and then I'll ask you, why is this 5 different from this 5? are those fives different? And then you're going to be like, I guess they're the same. It's like, are you sure they're absolutely the same? And then you wrote down other things, right? It's like, what did you do in this day? And what you do in this day? Are you telling me that somehow you do two different things and they're both the same fives? And then the idea would be, hey, you're right. Maybe I'll write something more than just a 5. Now I'm going to write a 5 minus and a 5 plus. And what happened there is you have just found a more efficient way to encode even more information than just settling for what you already know how to do. That's the idea. And that's kind of what therapists do, by the way. Like, I don't want to say that's their intent. Like, what I mean is that's not their objective task that they're doing. What they're trying to do is they're trying to encourage you to be proactive and go through self-discovery. So they ask questions to encourage you to be like, well, I don't really know the answer to that. Maybe I should try something that, and that's the how, right? The therapist is removing the why for you. So when you're in trouble, you're in like deep doo-doo, like you just don't know why things are happening, that why, a therapist is trying to offer you whys and get you to do hows. And then ultimately, hopefully one day, those hows turn into whys. And then the therapist, I mean, you're kind of paying them and it's their job, but still, like, the idea, at least for me, from my perspective, is not seeing you again. The whole point of being a therapist is hopefully you don't see the patient again, not as a patient, but perhaps as a friend, right? Like, the graduation of a patient to a friend is one of the biggest legacies for someone, especially like life coaching, teachers, anyone who's offering advice. The idea is having the student surpass the master or supersede the master, the need for the instructor, right? Be it a patient or to a therapist and whatnot. So that's kind of the idea. When you write things down, that's kind of the challenge. And it could be as simple as things like, how many steps did you take? Well, you can have programs to do that. I love smartphones, and here's my deal. When I was in graduate school, I still knew people who did not have smartphones. Even the most rigorous record-keeping people, and they love recording things. But during that time, I had the privilege of 1 or 2 people picking up a smartphone, and they took it to like glue. And I'm not talking about the whole like dependency of smartphone, like doom scrolling and stuff. I'm talking about they turned that smartphone into a record-keeping machine. Like, it was fantastic. And that's kind of one of the ways that I feel maximizing your efficiency has took a nosedive off of a cliff. While you're doom scrolling and doing all that stuff, you can extract so much information from that. But you're not doing it. The companies are. And they obviously were able to extract enough information to understand you probably better than yourself. And that's kind of where I come in my opinion. That's the fun part about technology and whatnot. Because data mining is absolutely phenomenal. So when it comes to like doom scrolling stuff, it's like, yeah, see, you can learn that stuff about yourself too if you had access to your own data, which you do. It's just you're not recording it, because in fact you have more data about yourself than a company has about yourself, but you've forgotten most of it. So the idea is, here's my catch 20, catch 22. I've got the phrase. Here's my catch 20. You know how people are worried about their privacy and their tracking and all the devices that track the stuff? It's like, yeah, I would be worried too if I haven't already tracked everything that I do too with those devices. So if this person says, they sold my information to, I don't know, someone that is trying to sell video games. It's like, yeah, I would sell video games to myself too. Because statistically, I've come to that same conclusion. But you know what they don't know? I can say no. That's the idea. Like, you're only as vulnerable as your lack of knowledge of yourself. I don't this is a deep cut, and I'm not gonna say it very boldly, but I would challenge that people's insecurity about their privacy is the fear of someone knowing more about them than themselves. And the insecurity comes from the idea that it's brewed from the idea that they actually know less or track less about themselves than a company that offers you a device. So here's a challenge. How well do you know yourself? Do you think the device that you're using tells you more about yourself than yourself inclined? Because I don't feel that way. But I'm not suggesting this is true for everyone. But what I'm saying is it's a fun social experiment to ask, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of the device tracking you better than you track yourself? So here's the whole idea, like, I'm afraid that they'll know something about me that I don't want other people to know. It's like, okay, well, that's fair. But so you are afraid that this thing is something that people don't want to know about. So you know this and you track and do this. So you are in control. But the fear is not in your control because it deals with a device that's tracking you. It's like, I'm not suggesting you should be guilty or you don't have the right to privacy. It's a fun social psychological experiment to ask yourself, your comfort and insecurity about your privacy, is there more to that fear than simply a concern for your privacy through a tracking device? Because for me, I would love a device to tell me that I have been declining in physical activity without me having to think it's important. For example, right? The pros and cons, the invisible benefits of preventive care and all that. That's something that I'm not willing to forfeit because I suck at tracking. And with that saying, if we're talking about comparative subjectivity here, if I suck at tracking and I am the standard for self-tracking, where do most of the population fall? So obviously that's unfair. I wouldn't suggest that that is evidence for people's non-willingness or capacity to write things down. But generally speaking, my phone, someone said this before where like this is a common thing with I guess frugility. I don't know, like being frugal, right? Being frugal or being what you call it, buyer's remorse, or trying to rationalize things like, oh yeah, I don't get a phone for 6 years, so I'm just gonna do this and that and this, and it's because phones are expensive and stuff's like, you mean your life investment isn't expensive? Like, it depends. What does that tell me? Well, you clearly don't know how to utilize technology. That's one of it's probably like 75% to 80%. You can't evaluate the value of technology. So how am I saying this? Is this subjective? So no, not really. Like, ask yourself, phones are really expensive, right? They're very expensive. So you're telling me that they're so expensive that people shouldn't be buying smartphones. But the idea is they are already expensive, not because that you think it's too expensive. Because if it was too expensive, it would be cheaper. It's already expensive. So how about asking yourself socially or cognitively, why are phones valued so highly? Not because of, stop thinking about yourself, you know, your ideas, your ideal values and stuff, and ask yourself, challenge yourself, and ask yourself, how can you get over $1,000 value out of a smartphone? So if you can't, why are you buying a smartphone that is $1,000? How do you know that it is not worth $1,000 if you yourself cannot conceive a smartphone to be worth $1,000? The value of that phone is a product of supply and demand. And, you know, you could argue, oh no, but it's corporate gouging and stuff. Say, all right, sure, I'll give you that. There's might be that, but we're not spinning that. We're spinning a psychological thing. It's a challenge to self. If you think something is super expensive, like for me, here's an example that I use all the time. This game is too expensive. I cannot get, you know, the value out of it that I get it now. Okay. I said it's too expensive, but I didn't say it's too expensive as in everyone should think it's too expensive. It's clearly not. What do? I basically, when someone asks me, I say it's too expensive for me right now. It's not going to be the same price and retain the same value later. And it'll meet my value system. So when you buy something and you complain about how much it costs or how annoying it is, or how, ask yourself, why can't you get that value out? Like, why are you even doing it in the first place? For me, I have an answer. Like, why am I playing this game if it's annoying me? It's because I want to know what annoys me. That's why. To those people that I was talking about about smartphones, it's annoying them and they don't even know why it's annoying them or why they're even doing it because it's annoying them. And one of the questions to be like, well, I don't want it to annoy me. It's like, then why do it? For me, the answer is I want to be annoyed because I need to learn about what the heck annoys me. So I literally have an affirmation of why I'm doing it. The other way is like, I don't get it. If you're so averse to not doing this, you're clearly not asking or reflecting properly, because you decided that I don't understand why I'm getting a smartphone, but you still got a smartphone. So you clearly have the answer. You have the answer for yourself. There are probably more pros than cons for having the smartphone, but instead you decide to choose to express the cons instead of the pros. So for every day I am without a smartphone, I'm tracking exponentially less data. That's just it. And you can make an argument for every day some company is getting more information about myself. That's fine. Yeah. That's the trade-off. So to those who are like naysayers and stuff, it's like, oh, okay, well, you can just get a smartphone that don't collect any data. Go find one. Good luck. Good luck and find one. It's like, well, no, I have to use this smartphone because I don't, there aren't smartphones that meet my demands while having my, you know, while having to trade off my privacy. It's like, yeah, you got it. You're getting closer. You're definitely getting closer. You can voice your criticisms for sure. Absolutely. But you're still doing the task. That's a complaint, by the way. Like, what I mean is that one of the this is another digression, but we're gonna stop here. Really, we'll talk. It's a digression about the difference between a non-constructive complaint and constructive criticism. But when you're doing something and then you're making a critique about it emotionally, that's a non-constructive criticism. It's a criticism that is clouded by ad hominem arguments usually and emotional arguments. When you are doing something and you look at your motivations and how it properly fulfills your motivations, that enables you to make constructive criticisms of the like ups and downs, because you're no longer blindly selectively focusing on specific things, like how this game sucks because it doesn't have your favorite character in it, how this movie is fantastic because it has your favorite actor in it. Those are all emotional, selective, non-constructive criticisms. So when you ask someone like, hey, you're gonna like this movie because it has my favorite actor in it, like that's non-constructive criticism. It's not gonna help that person know if they're gonna like it or not. Alternatively, I heard you have seen 6 of this actor's movies, and overall you liked most of these previous 6 actors' movies. Perhaps there's a chance, or a heightened chance, that you will like this movie because this actor is in it. That is constructive criticism. So the other way, that's not only is different between constructive criticism and complaints. I use the positive version. That's confirmation bias. So when you're using confirmation bias for a nice thing, like, oh, you'll love this game because I love it, that kind of thing, that's confirmation bias. So that's almost like conning people. That's what con artists do, by the way. So the positive and negative are different from constructive criticism. Constructive criticism can both be positive and negative. Like, for example, you did this really well. That's constructive criticism for X, Y, and Z reason, like for X, Y, and Z results and facts. So constructive criticism can be both positive and negative. It's just most people focus on negative. And that's kind of one of the psychological human conditions. Negative events are far more resonant than positive events. But that's also another digression, which I'm sure there are plenty of people who have spun this a billion times. All right, cool. All right, that's it. We're going to cut it off here. It was great chatting. Josh, as always, thanks for being the scapegoat, or the unceremonious volunteer, and Fictitious with his taglines. You know, I'm sure Fictitious has many thoughts to himself. All right, I'll let you guys go. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, good luck. You know, live intentfully. Just go after that happiness, all right? Go after opportunities. And I will I will catch you guys on the next one. All right? Take care. See ya.